La Plata County, Colorado.
1887. The first time Ruth Calder crossed onto Eli Stroud's land, she did it at gunpoint, hers, not his. Her cattle were dying. The drought had killed the grass on her side of the fence, and the only water within 10 miles was the spring on Stroud's property. So Ruth cut his fence, drove her herd through, and dared him to do something about it. Eli Stroud did do something about it, but it was not what Ruth expected. And it was not what anyone in Durango would have predicted, because the feud between the Calder ranch and the Stroud ranch had been going for 15 years, and it was about to end in the one way that nobody saw coming. This is the story of a woman who crossed a fence to save her cattle, and a man who crossed a line he had drawn around his own heart 15 years before. The Calder and Stroud ranches shared a fence line greater than music, greater than, and a hatred that predated both Ruth and Eli. It had started in 1872 over water rights. Ruth's father, Angus Calder, and Eli's father, Thomas Stroud, had filed competing claims on the same creek. The dispute went to court. The court split the water. Neither man, music, accepted the ruling. They spent the next 15 years cutting each other's fences, poisoning each other's wells, and raising children to believe that the family on the other side of the fence was the enemy. Angus Calder died in 1885. Thomas Stroud died in 1886. Fathers were gone, but the feud remained, inherited by Ruth and Eli, the way some families inherit silver and others inherit debt. Ruth Calder was 31. She had taken over the Calder Ranch when her father died, against the advice of every man in La Plata County. She was small, sharp, and entirely without patience for the idea that she could not, music, do something because she was a woman. She had run the ranch for 2 years, through her own competence, and her absolute refusal to fail in front of men who wanted her to. Eli Stroud was 34. He had inherited the Stroud Ranch and the feud, and he wanted neither. He was a quiet man who had spent 15 years being told to hate a family he had never had a reason to hate. He had gone along with it because going along was easier than fighting his father. Now his father was dead, and Eli was left holding a hatred he did not feel for a woman he had never spoken to. Then the drought came, and the drought did not care about feuds. When Ruth Calder music, Eli Stroud's fence, and drove her dying cattle to his spring, she expected a war. What she got was the beginning of the end of one. Eli Stroud rode out to his spring on a July morning music and found 400 Calder cattle drinking from it, a cut fence behind them, and Ruth Calder sitting on her horse, with a rifle across her saddle, watching him approach. He stopped 20 yards away. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the cut fence. He looked at the rifle. He said, "You cut my fence." He looked at the rifle. He said, "You cut my fence." Ruth said, "My cattle are dying. Your spring is the only water for 10 miles. I'll pay for the fence. I'll pay for the water, but my cattle drink music today. And if you try to stop me, we're going to have a conversation neither of us walks away from clean." Eli looked at her for a long moment. 15 years of feud said he should drive her cattle off, repair his fence, and report the trespass to the sheriff. 15 years of his father's voice in his head said that a Calder on Stroud land was an act of war. Instead, Eli Stroud did something that ended the feud in a single sentence. Greater than music. Greater than, he said, "Keep your money. Water's water. No creature should die of thirst 40 feet from a full spring, because our fathers were too stubborn to share." Creek. Ruth stared at him. She had prepared for a fight. She had prepared for the sheriff. She had not prepared for kindness because in 15 years no Stroud had ever offered a Calder anything but hostility. She said, "Why?" Eli said, "Because I'm tired." My father hated your father for 15 years and it killed him angry and poor. I buried him last year. I don't want to be buried angry. Your cattle can drink, so can mine. The spring's big enough. Ruth Calder lowered her rifle. For the first time in her life, she looked at a Stroud and did not see an enemy. She saw a tired man standing beside a spring offering water to cattle that belonged to a family he, Music, had been raised to hate. She said, I'll fix the fence. Eli said, leave a gate, Music in it. Your side's going to be dry until the rains come. Might as well make it easy. He rode away. Ruth sat on her horse beside the spring and watched him go and felt something she could not name shift inside her chest. A boundary she had not known she was defending suddenly undefended. That was the first trespass the land. It was easy compared to the ones that came next. Through the rest of that drought summer, the Calder and Stroud cattle shared the Stroud Spring. This required cooperation. It required Ruth and Eli to speak to each other about rotation schedules, about which herd watered when, about the management of a resource that had started a 15-year war and was now, unexpectedly, the thing that brought peace. They met at the spring most mornings. At first, the conversations were purely functional. Cattle, water, weather, but functional. Conversations repeated daily. Between two intelligent people do not stay functional. They drift. They deepen. They become something else. Ruth H. learned that Eli read poetry, which he hid from everyone because of poetry reading. Rancher was a target for ridicule. Eli learned that Ruth could quote the entire territorial water law from memory and had a plan to challenge it in court. They learned that they disagreed about almost everything and enjoyed every disagreement. In August, Eli crossed onto Calder land without cattle, without a reason, without permission. He rode to Ruth's ranch house, carrying a sack of peaches from the orchard his mother had planted before she died. He said, the tree's overproducing. Figured you might want some before they rot. It was the first time Stroud had crossed onto Calder land in 15 years for any reason other than sabotage. Ruth understood the significance, so did Eli. Neither of them mentioned it. She invited him in. He stayed for 2 hours. They ate peaches and argued about whether the railroad would help or ruin the territory. When he left, Ruth stood on her porch and watched him ride back toward his own land and realized that the fence between their properties had stopped meaning anything weeks ago. By September, the drought had broken. The rains came. The grass returned to Calder land. Ruth no longer needed the Stroud spring, and that was the problem because the spring had been the reason, the excuse for the daily meetings. Without it, there was no functional reason for Ruth Calder and Eli Stroud to see each other every morning. The first morning after the rains, Ruth rode to the spring Music out of habit. Eli was already there. He had no cattle with him. Neither did she. They looked at each other across the spring that no longer connected them. Eli said, your grass came back, Ruth said. It did, Eli said. So you don't need the water anymore? Ruth said, no. There was a long silence, the kind of silence where both people know what is being music, decided and neither wants to be the one to say it. Eli said, Music came anyway, Ruth said. So did I. That was the second trespass, the distance. And it led, inevitably, to the third, the one that 15 music years of Feud had been built specifically to prevent. The town of Durango found out before either of them admitted it to themselves. Music, a Calder and a Stroud, meeting at the boundary spring every morning after the drought had ended. Music. There was no other explanation. The feud that had defined La Plata County for 15 years was ending in the most scandalous way. The two heirs were falling in love. The reaction was hostile. Old allies of Angus Calder told Ruth she was betraying her father's memory. Old friends of Thomas Stroud told Eli he was a disgrace to the family name. The hatred that the fathers had planted did not want to die. It had roots in too many people. Ruth and Eli met at the spring on a cold October morning to decide what to do. Ruth said, "The whole county thinks we've lost our minds." Eli said, "The whole county spent 15 years watching our fathers destroy themselves over a creek." "I don't much care what they think," Ruth said. "My father would turn in his grave," Eli said. "Maybe, or maybe he'd be relieved that one of us finally had the sense to stop. I don't know what the dead want, Ruth. I only know what I want. And I crossed your fence in August carrying Peach's music, because I wanted to see you, not because of any tree." Ruth looked at him. She had spent her whole life being told that the man, music, standing in front of her was the enemy. She had inherited that hatred, the way she had inherited the ranch without being asked as a condition of her birth. She said, "My father drew a line around this whole family. He said no Calder would ever trust a Stroud. He made me promise," Eli said. And Ruth said, "And I'm about music. To break the only promise I ever made him." She crossed the spring, the boundary, the line her father had drawn, the 15 years of feud. She crossed all of it. And she kissed Eli Stroud beside the water that had started the war and ended it. Ruth Calder and Eli Stroud were married on December 20th, 1887, at the courthouse in Durango. The wedding was sparsely attended. Many people in La Plata County considered the marriage a scandal, a betrayal, or both. Ruth and Eli did not care. They combined the two ranches into one. The Calder-Stroud spread, and they tore down the fence between the properties. Not all of it. They left one post standing with a small brass plaque that Eli made himself. It read, "Here stood a fence that two foolish men defended for 15 years. Their children took it down in a single afternoon. They shared the spring. They shared the water. They shared everything their fathers had fought to keep separate. Within 5 years, the combined ranch was the most successful operation in the county because two ranches sharing water and labor were far stronger than two ranches at war. The people who had opposed the marriage came around, slowly the way people do when they watch something work that they predicted would fail. By the time Ruth and Eli's first child was born, the feud was a story that old men told and young people did not believe. Ruth and Eli Stroud ran the combined ranch for 36 years. They had 4 children. The fence post with the brass plaque stood until 1955 when a Calder-Stroud grandchild moved it to the local historical museum where it remains. Eli died in 1923. Ruth lived until 1934. She was 78. In her final years, she would tell visitors the story of the day she cut Eli's fence at gunpoint and drove her dying cattle to his spring expecting a war. "I crossed onto his land to save my cattle," she would say. "I did not know I was crossing into the rest of my life." She crossed his fence without permission. He crossed into her heart without warning. And between them, they ended a war that 2 generations had been unable to end any other way. If this story stayed with you, tell me, would you have had the courage to break the promise to your father? And if you want another story about love that grew where music was forbidden, it's right here.